this is going to be super informal, so I've got a couple of questions I want to ask, and I definitely want people to chime in, and you beat me to it. I wanted maybe to actually talk about, global warming, climate change, climate variability is something I hear a lot of people say now, weather. What do these terms mean? What do you use? And what do you mean when you use them? And how do you think people understand you when you use them?
Yes. All right, thank you. Oh yeah, that's a good question. So usually when we use the term climate change, that's kind of a more generic term. They're talking about all kinds of changes.
Yeah.
So you talk about it. In fact, this is the part that I left out of the slides was there's what we call I would call natural climate change, was just how the atmosphere behaves over time, even if we weren't here. So we know in the past there's been changes because of changes in ocean circulation, how the Earth rotates around the sun. You throw in a couple of volcanoes, those kinds of things can cause the climate to change. And those have occurred, they're occurring now, and that will also occur into the future. So that's kind of the background for any kind of climate discussion. Then on top of it is this human-induced climate change. And first, they kind of gone back and forth on what they call that global warming, because that's a very specific part of it, is that as you add more of these heat-trapping gases, yes, you will warm up the atmosphere, but that's not the only thing we're worried about. We're also worried about the other kind of changes that are taking place too because of that. So I think at one point it was kind of more in vogue to say global warming when you're talking about that problem. But now it's probably the more proper way to say it is that I'd say it would be the human-induced climate change versus the natural climate change. So when we talk about temperatures getting warmer, or we're talking about more heavy rain events, or less snowfall in the Rockies, those kind of things are part of the climate change discussion that we have. So that's kind of how I parse it out when we talk about those. Yes?
Haven't we got 50, 30, 70 years weather cycles? How is it comparing to what the historic weather cycles have been? Because I've only been on this earth 60 years, 65 years, and I've seen trends change, but you're contributed partially to natural trend lines, and how is it changing it according to that?
Yeah, so there's, another thing I didn't put in the slides was I actually have a little bit of history in Illinois that go back to the 1800s. It looks like that period was much colder and wetter than what we experience today. And then it kind of dried out in around 1900. It got warmer and stayed that way for about 60 or 70 years. And then it's kind of switched gears, and now we're in more of this warm and wet mode that we've been in the last 30 or 40 years. So there are kind of, and I kind of hinted at it earlier about, we're not just looking at trends, but a lot of times these things do kind of occur in steps. So we've seen that in the past, and it's kind of done that more recently too. Now, our records in Illinois, about the earliest I've seen go back to 1820. Before that, it's all secondary evidence. So you can look at things like what was growing here naturally 1,000 years ago. They have some records of pollen and stuff like that. So you can kind of get an idea. And I know, and it's not my area of expertise, but I know in general that Illinois at some point in the last couple of thousand years was actually hot and dry based on the kind of natural species we saw across the state. So there are these other, like I said, the earlier about the natural variations in climate that take place, and those are always in place. But the concern now is with this additional change that we're putting into it. And this one, also the other thing about the human-induced changes, that this is coming on much faster and much more intense. A lot of the historical ones, it might take thousands or tens of thousands of years to warm up a couple of degrees, whereas this we're talking about within a generation or two.
So I went to a greenhouse this morning, And I bought some starter plants for my garden, and it was lovely in the greenhouse. And it seemed like, thanks for coming. It seemed like a fantastic environment to grow plants. So, I mean, what's the problem with greenhouse gases, and what are some of maybe some of the concerns with, like, maybe, I don't know, weeds or other kinds of pests or something like that? And I don't know, maybe Troy, you could speak to some of that, or?
Well,
There's also this too, I guess, and I'll run out.
I mean, the reality, when you look at climate change, the reality is there will be, if the models are correct, and as I'm sure Jim would agree, that there are models all over the place, but when we talk about global warming or climate change, I mean, it's clear that there will be some parts of the world that will be able to grow crops much better than they can right now. And there will be some parts of the world that are going to face challenges, that they haven't had to face before in growing crops. So things are going to shift, and I think you'll probably see over the long term, I think it's reasonable to assume that you're going to see a shift of where crops are grown and what crops are grown in different areas. I mean, that's the market and the environment is going to drive that. People are going to grow crops where they can be grown. And so, I mean, it's not a cookie cutter thing where you can say climate change is going to lead to famine and droughts and we're not going to be able to grow crops anymore. I mean, some parts of the world will be able to grow crops way better than they can now. So there's no one answer to that question, I don't think.
I mean, I'm just going to ask it, could it lead to famine? Is that like a ridiculous question for anybody to worry about or think about, or is that something we should be thinking about, or is that something we should be thinking about because we're in the Midwest and maybe we're in a better situation than maybe some coastal areas that might be, or California, which is in a very severe drought?
So, I mean, go ahead.
Well, yes, I think there is a possibility of famine, not so much in the Midwest, but certainly other parts of the world are much more vulnerable to long-term droughts and more heat and so forth. We're actually, Illinois is kind of the sweet spot right now. I mean, we can get a couple of degrees warmer or a little bit wetter, a little bit drier, and we'll still make out pretty well. But it's, again, the one things that are on the margin that are really going to feel the pinch on this, and perhaps already are. If you look at the southwestern United States, they're already running into water supply issues right now, and I don't see that getting any better. Meanwhile, in North Dakota, they're growing corn, so we've already seen some of these shifts taking place as we speak. So I think that is one of the concerns, is that it could be tough in some areas. The other thing too is that the more well-to-do countries are probably going to fare better than the ones that aren't so well off financially too. So I think there's other inequalities as well as just who's getting the rain, who isn't, that there's going to be some places that are really going to hurt from this and not be able to respond.
So we're like in a super sweet spot because we're both in the United States, and right, we're kind of in something that I think you may have called a warming pocket.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. So we talked about that off the air, as you guys would say. That Illinois is we're not seeing the warming here that we're seeing in other parts of the country. So we kind of call this, well, I call it a warming hole, which it isn't the right word, but it's kind of it's warming less here than it is in other parts of the United States.
I think we're trying to oversimplify agricultural production just to one facet, because agricultural production includes multiple facets, as Dr. Gruber would attest to. Because one thing that we have here in the Midwest is soils that will help mitigate some of these changes. So just to focus on climate change and food production, granted it's a valid point, but yet I think you have to understand that even though climate changes to the better, maybe on the East Coast, they have older soils, they have less potential for actual agricultural production than what we do because of our soils. So I think soils not only are they incredibly important in agricultural production, but they're also important in mitigating global climate, the CO2 or the carbon issues.
You're talking about like carbon sequestration?
Absolutely,
and
absolutely. Because
do
probably
people know what carbon sequestration? Yeah, okay.
it is not our soils one of our largest carbon sinks on Earth, Doc.
Yep.
So, that's one thing that we have to keep in mind, that agricultural production is not just a single faceted thing associated with only climate change, but it also has to do with the depletion of our soils and the carbon that we need to put back into our soils. I think Doc could speak to that.
Well, I just wanted to quickly ask a question. The idea that we will have some areas that will be blessed by warming and other areas that might find that more challenging, is that a seamless transition that we can expect, that where we currently have the infrastructure, we currently have the experience and knowledge, we currently have the best soils, if things change fairly quickly, so that we have a more favorable climate in, Manitoba, is that area really capable in a number of decades to take on what we can accomplish in the Corn Belt today? Their soils will not change in a decade or two. Their infrastructure perhaps could, but we're talking about changes that are more than the climate. We're talking about all sorts of things that have to change to go together for agronomy to be effective. So, any thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely, and that is, that's a big unknown, is how fast is this going to happen? Certainly, there's, and I didn't mean to imply that areas with poor soils now are going to become breadbaskets, anytime soon, and I probably oversimplified it, but no, it's absolutely true. It all depends on how fast that happens. The fact of the matter is there's going to be shifts. We've already seen it. How fast those shifts are going to happen, how fast they can happen, we don't know. And there's certainly going to, Mother Nature's going to set limits on that. She holds those cards. It's just, that's not a question anybody can answer right now, because we don't know. We don't know where those shifts are going to go and how fast they're going to happen. The question was, can climate change make it better? Actually make it better? And the answer is, in some places it will. In some places it'll make it worse.
I guess I'm asking about our ability to adapt, and certainly technology companies are, positioning themselves to bring about, help our farm community bring about that adaptation.
And so if you think about what the industry is doing, we're continually breeding, we're continually improving technology and precision, we're continually getting a better understanding of how to manage fertility and how to manage pests and things like that. And we look at these things, we're breeding and selecting the best hybrids and varieties every year. And we're looking at what sorts of agronomic systems, what sorts of practices work best every year. And if that change happens gradually enough, we're going to be, we're going to be selecting hybrids and varieties and practices and systems and technologies that are going to sort of follow those changes. But if it happens very quickly, that's going to limit our ability to keep up with that.
Question. Thank you for coming, because this is a needed conversation, and I think there is a sense of urgency here. I happen to be, they had Stephen Kerwood, I think was, Living on Earth. WIU brought him to speak. And he was one of the first people that I really paid attention to. And he's an NPR spokesman sometimes, but he was very eloquent in talking about a lot of the things that we're talking about right now. And as Joe presented his question, But one of the things that he talked about was that 2/3 of our population is on the East Coast and the West Coast, and with climate change and warming, a lot of our water, frozen water is melting, and what happens is that we're going to have flooding in the East Coast and the West Coast, and we are in a sweet spot here in Illinois, because he said we were one of the last ones to be hit. But the thing that we have to fend off is all the people from the West Coast and the East Coast coming, and how do we build walls against Americans? So the thought here is that, for me, it's, and I have children and population growth, and we need to feed them, and it's nice that we're talking about this, because this is a difficult topic. We all have to live, but anyhow, this, and then I refer to Al Gore and his presentation. It's meteoric. I mean, it's going very fast, and we do need to discuss this a lot more. It's nice that we are talking about it now, but I think this is an important topic that we really need to get involved in, and even at the elementary level. It's nice that we're all here to do this, because we're seeking some kind of answers. But I've been paying attention to climate and the talk behind it, and I really feel that it's an essential topic that we have to talk about these days anyway.
I'd like to maybe make one.
Sure.
So I hope we never build walls. I hope, like I said, like let's, you know, everybody that's in this room right now, like let's agree that, you know, if it gets really bad, like let's not build walls against each other. Let's try to figure something else out. And I think that we're all here, you know, I think that we want to. I appreciate your comments, and I.
Well, the thing is that also the
definitely
land
think
is getting shorter, so there's less farmland.
Totally.
You know, and
No, I get it. Yeah. Still, no walls. Like inside ourselves, outside ourselves. Let's just keep open. Yeah. Where was I going to go with that? Population growth. I wanted to bring this up. I don't think the population is growing as quickly as we thought it was growing. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no. I actually think I'm not wrong. I think
Maybe
that
the United States is.
so we're still growing, but we have the kind of exponential growth that was happening is for the first time in human history started to slow down. So maybe we're not growing, but the growth is slowed.
Not here, but.
Well, no, I'm talking about worldwide too, actually. Like.
Levels of birth control and population, it's not following the same curve at all in developed countries. They are getting their control over their reproduction much faster than we are, and they're also not using any resources, so we can't criticize them anyway.
So that's a complicated topic, but it's definitely worth something like looking at, because I was sort of under this impression. I mean, I'm 29. I think a lot about should I have a kid, and I often think no, I should adopt. So, you know, I think it's a serious conversation to have. It's definitely a question to ask, and there's a lot of information out there. But I wanted to bring Adam into this conversation because, you know, that 8% that are kind of looking at this reality, what accounts for that 8%? Also, I've spoken with a lot of farmers who, you know, feel maybe, like I think it's the EPA says that farmers are maybe responsible for about 9% of emissions or something like that, and most of us are like, you know, our households are responsible for about 12% of greenhouse gas emissions. But farmers feel maybe like a little beaten down by that. They feel like people kind of hold them responsible disproportionately or something. And I'm wondering, you know, when you talk to farmers, like how do they feel, and you know, why are they less open than the people who are in this room to some of the information that you know, climate scientists are bringing to the table?
And what kind of farmers were you talking about when you said 5,000 farmers?
So
So the survey was 5,000 predominantly corn grain farmers, so corn and soybean growers in the north central region, so from South Dakota over to Ohio down to Missouri.
It might be easier for you.
And I guess I'd like to preface with sort of going back to an earlier question. You know, the word climate evokes a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And the phrase climate change evokes even more things to different people. And so when we're talking about climate, we're talking about sort of multiple things, but two distinct things. We're talking about the historical past climate. So we're talking about how 1900, et cetera, is aggregated into now, and we're talking about future climate models. So projections for the year 2050 and beyond. And so when you say climate, it's important to sort of be specific in which one of those things you're talking about. So I think when Dr. Angel presents, really emphasizes the past, and so how that can sort of inform decision-making moving forward. On the flip side, some climate scientists are really focused upon the future. And so when you're thinking about climate science, it's sort of contextualized in this temporal dimension of time, right? And so every moment in time, as we're collecting meteorological weather data, that's feeding back into our climate models, and that's adjusting, you know, both the past, the history climate models, and the future models. And so every moment in time, arguably, climate is changing. And so I've heard people say it's sort of a misnomer to say climate change, because by definition, climate is always changing. So what we're really talking about is climate and climate science, and recognizing that the tools climate science has available can be very valuable in informing decision making. But sort of getting back to this 8% thing, I hypothesize that this temporal dimension sort of puts a constraint on decision making in agricultural contexts. So
Wait, say that again?
the time dimension. So for example, when you make a decision to grow a crop or perform tillage, you can make that decision to reap a yield 1 year from now, you know, for the sake of paying your property taxes and putting your
Getting
kids
your
through
cash
school.
rents back.
Yeah,
and
those types
paying
of
on that
things.
combine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can be making that decision to ensure you have soil water retention, soil organic carbon, and all those beneficial ecosystem services in the year 2050 and beyond. And so what we're really finding as the science develops is those two things don't have to be separate. Farmers really don't have to be constrained in only growing a thing that they can reap a yield next year to pay their taxes. But we can do management techniques that allow that and allow the insurance of beneficial ecosystem services, so soil water retention, the soil health, and all these types of things that tools like microbiology are really advancing and understanding the importance in soil and ensuring productive yields. And so how we balance, you know, the human production and how we project science onto nature, but how also nature balances sort of the ecological integrity of agriculture. And so that survey was from the year 2012, and I'm sure if we did it again, we would find more farmers that are being receptive to what we call climate change, however they conceive that themselves. But I think the point is farmers as a social group are becoming more receptive to recognizing the tools of climate science can be valuable for ensuring both their individual production, you know, for their livelihood, and also for adapting to and mitigating the effects of both local and global climate change. So that's my 2 cents.
Yep.
Speaking as a farmer, I think what will be the most impressive is the soil health. You guys promoting good soil health until it's going to be very difficult for me to start making plans on the temperature in 30 years. But I know if I protect my soil, then it'll pay me back.
In terms of preventing famine around the world, don't you think it's a good idea to have as many varieties of different crops available, and that we should encourage people in Africa and India and China to be growing the seeds that they've been growing for hundreds of years that work in their climate and that they can afford to save and plant from year to year rather than trying new varieties that they cannot save from year to year and are more expensive, and I think would be more apt to lead to a famine because they can't afford to continue in that style. Anyone would like to address that question?
So I'm a little confused about
Okay.
the question.
Africans say have been saving a certain type of corn for a long time. They grow it.
So,
they
I
can
feel like
say,
this is the question for Troy, probably.
Yeah,
So this
probably
is
so.
about,
I'm concerned about people in Africa, tribes anywhere in the world losing their original variety of corn, beans, whatever crop. I feel like they get convinced to grow a new variety where they can't save the seed, where they end up
Is it-
losing money. I think there's more apt to be a chance of famine because of that than if they keep their own varieties.
This is totally my ignorance, but if you have a seed that has, and this is for you, Troy, but if you have a seed that has traits that you've bought from a seed company that has invested a lot of money, for instance, drought-tolerant corn, can you save that corn and plant it again? Why are you not allowed to do that? Is there-
It depends on the type of crop you're talking about. So nobody, very, very few people in countries that grow hybrids, they don't save seed because, basically what you do is and if you take a look at that,
Slide.
if you remember that slide
Yeah.
that I had, okay, in the early 1900s, and before that, the slide that I had started in 1900, that's what farmers were doing. They were saving seeds and replanting them, and they were, they did that for decades and decades and decades. And if you look at the yield trends were actually down. It's the yields were slowly getting less and less, and there's a lot of factors there. Some of it is what you would call inbred depression. I mean, you're letting these plants pollinate with each other, and then you're saving them, and then you're letting them pollinate with each other again, and you're saving them. Then you saw in the early 1930s, you saw all of a sudden a pretty major uptick in production and in yields, and then you saw kind of another one in the 1950s and 1960s. And a big part of that was the concept of hybrid seed production, where we started creating inbreds, pure inbreds, crossing this inbred with this inbred, you end up with a hybrid. A hybrid is a plant that is, you got mom over here, you got dad over here, you cross them, you've got junior, and junior is much better and stronger and more productive than mom and dad put together. And so, you don't, if you end up saving that seed and replant, it has nothing to do with traits. If you save that seed and replant it, then you end up with something that is less productive and less uniform, and then you're back on that same trend again. And so that's why farmers don't save corn. Now, there are other crops like soybean, for example. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight because that's what I know. But these same types of concepts apply to crops, different crops all over the world. Soybeans, we grow essentially inbreds because, with corn, we've got the male flower up here, the female flower down here, so we can cover one up and we can very easily control that pollination. Well, with soybeans, the male part of the flower and the female part of the flower are that far apart, on each and every individual flower, and so we can control those crosses on a small scale, but then we have to grow them up on a large scale. And essentially what we're doing is we're growing inbreds with those crops. Those crops can be saved and replanted. Now, once you get into, once companies begin to produce seed, obviously they have to pay breeders and they make an investment. And so we have things called the Plant Variety Protection Act. I forget exactly what it's called, but to help companies recoup that investment, they started placing restrictions on whether or not you can do that. And then of course now with biotech traits, you're not allowed to save those because again those are patented and you've got to be able to recoup their investment. Now, we'll go a long way around to get back to your original question, and I guess the way that I would answer your question is to go back to that bar graph that I showed earlier. Certainly there is a need to keep the heirloom varieties and the original genetics and to have those sources to use in breeding programs and things like that, and we want to keep those sources. We don't want to lose them, and we're trying very hard not to lose them. But I would go back to that bar graph. If that's what we're going to grow, we're going to need a lot more land and a lot more resources to produce the same amount
Well, in order to get
of
that
stuff.
bar graph to go up like that, don't you have to have big tractors, pesticides, herbicides, be able to buy more expensive seed, which I don't think the Africans can do. They can't compete with us on the scale and the cost of farming.
So you got to remember, it's not what causes that bar graph to get those strips to get smaller and shorter is a whole host of different things. A big part of it, in the case of corn, a big part of it was the hybrid production, the breeding techniques that I talked about. Some of it was better ways to control pests. Some of it was better sources of nutrients. Some of it was better ways to till the soil and leave some of the residue on the surface, more accurately place those nutrients. Some of it was, different ways to become more precise with all of the different tools that we were using, and to be able to use some technologies I can talk about in a little bit to increase the pace at which we can improve the genetics by using some new tools along with traditional breeding to be able to increase that pace. So it's not just we got to have pesticides, or we got to have this, or we got to have that. There's all of these different things that come together as a system, and when you take a look at the amount of food that we can produce and the amount of resources it takes to make each bushel or each ton or each pound or however you want to measure it, the gains that we've made have been phenomenal.
Is this affordable in third world countries?
Farming in the 30s was organic, wasn't it? Basically organic farming. They had no modern tractors, or they used horses and
Right.
yeah.
I mean, in a sense, it was organic. It wasn't very good management of the soil.
Yeah,
You
but-
could have called it organic. I wouldn't call it organic as
Well,
well.
I compared to that, but what I'm saying, as far as an African country today, they could reproduce the same scenario that we had in the 30s, 40s.
Mhm.
They were still using very simple tools and horses and shucking the corn by hand. Most people lived on 80 acres. Yeah.
So yeah, this is sort of about a comment or a slide that you had, Dr. Angel, and it's a question for Troy, Mr. Kozier. Sure. Okay. So it seems like some of these oscillations, these really erratic sort of oscillations that we've been seeing lately, have been occurring on the scale of, the past few decades anyway. So you've already touched on this a little bit, but I'm just curious as to what sorts of, how do you, or how does Monsanto or any seed company that is developing new hybrids, new lines, anticipate those types of oscillations? And especially when you said it could take, a decade for something to get through the pipes. I mean, how do you plan for these erratic sort of oscillations? And moreover, do you think that we are, with sort of these trends that we see, are we actually keeping pace with that? Or is it up in the air?
Oh, I think we're more than keeping pace with it so far. When you look at production levels, you look at what the agriculture industry as a whole has been able to do. I think we're more than keeping pace with it. I'm probably in danger of oversimplifying things again, but when you look at what we do, everything that we do, almost everything that we do, can be really boiled down to relieving stress on that plant. Okay? No matter what the crop is, its maximum potential is when it's still sitting as a seed in the bag. The moment you take that seed out of the bag and you put it in the ground, it begins to lose potential because it's never in a perfect environment. It's always being exposed to some kind of stress. It's a little too hot, it's a little too cold, it's a little too wet, it's a little too dry, there's disease pathogens trying to grow on it, there's bugs trying to munch on it, there's weeds trying to take water and nutrients, and so on. Okay? So everything that we do in the agronomic systems research, and I'm not just talking about Monsanto, I'm talking about the industry, and what's going on at the universities as well. I guess I shouldn't speak for you, but I mean, I think most everything that we do boils down to relieving stress. How many plants per acre should we put out there? What's the optimum spacing? What's the optimum placing of the, how much nutrient and where should it be? How can we best control, how can we best keep pests away? How can we best keep diseases away? How can we best utilize the moisture that we've got? It's all about relieving stress. And it's a mammoth task to bring all of those things together in a system, and it's been fairly recent, I think, that we've really started to look in depth at systems. For years and years and years, we looked at all this stuff piecemeal. What happens when you change row spacing? What happens when you change your nitrogen? What happens? And the reality is, when you change your nitrogen, you're going to get a different response depending on your plant density. If you change your tillage, you're going to get a different response based on, and so on. So it's a mammoth task. But all of these things, and it goes back to the comment I said a little while ago, and I guess I'm yakking a lot now. I better wrap this up. We're doing all of this in the environment that we have. And if it's slowly getting warmer, we're going to be selecting for hybrids and varieties and techniques and tools that are going to perform better as it's getting warmer. If it's slowly getting drier, we're going to be selecting techniques that do better as it gets drier. The question becomes, if that happens very quickly, it's going to be very difficult to keep up with that.
Well, and Jim, you talked about the idea of steps.
Yeah.
Is that quick? I mean, is that like?
Historically, some of those steps have occurred on fairly short order, on an order of a decade. So, I mean, not necessarily that this year we got hot and we'll just stay hot for the rest of the time, but some of the historical ones have been on the order of a decade or so. So it could be
so quickly.
So it could be pretty quickly on some of those, but.
Okay, you had a question next.
I think there's a disconnect between how we talk about food in this part of the country and about food globally. I mean, we're in Illinois, corn and soybeans are what people grow, that's what my dad grows. But we're spending a lot of time talking about food from the perspective of people who grow corn and soybeans, which aren't food. And I'm curious to see how things will change, because I think, first of all, a lot of people are deciding to eat differently in the U.S., and we have a changing diet maybe. I think also things are going to change in a way that corn and soybeans aren't just, even here they won't be considered food, because we'll need to grow more crops, different varieties, and I just think it's interesting. I think this was going to happen possibly quickly, and I'm curious to see how it's going to turn out.
So, and I know we talk about corn and soybeans, and that's technically not food, but, and again, I talk about it because that's what I know and that's what I'm familiar with, but reality is, if you look at a broccoli bar graph or a potato bar graph, it's pretty much the same story. I mean, the concepts that we're talking about here about improved breeding techniques, improved agronomic systems, and other things, all of these different things that we're doing are being done in other crops too, and we're seeing those yield increases in them.
Well, and isn't it, I think our disconnect here is because this was supposed to be about the future of food and drink. And we've been talking about corn and soybeans. And I just tried to look it up, maybe Joel knows, or maybe even you know, Ned. What percentage of corn and soybeans becomes food?
2% of corn calories go into human consumption, mostly as corn syrup. About 40% goes into beef at a 10-to-1 calorie loss, if I'm not mistaken.
And then there's
And pork, and chicken. Yeah, there's several different things.
To me, we're missing the whole point. Agriculture includes all food production, vegetables, the whole gamut. But how do we address the disease, not the symptoms? Because by developing new hybrids that are going to respond to drought better, it's just addressing the symptom. It's not addressing the disease. how do we address the disease, not necessarily the symptoms?
And that you would diagnose the disease as?
As the
increased
climate change,
greenhouse
increased carbon, how do we address, and agriculture can be a major player in that. By addressing by addressing the disease, it's kind of like modern medicine. The only time we made advances in modern medicine was with the advent of antibiotics. It treated the actual cause, and up to then we were just treating the effects. We weren't actually treating the disease. So how do we, and I think Dr. Gruber probably can address that.
I mean, I think this is a very large conversation to be having. I think, when I was thinking about trying to figure out who to invite to the panel, there's a lot of people. I definitely wanted more farmers. I'm happy that there's some here. I also thought, it would be good to have somebody who could speak from a political perspective, because I think that there's responsibility there, and there's an obligation to the public, and that's a part of, should be a part of this conversation. The mayor was here, he stepped out. Joel.
Well, I'm so glad that you just brought up politics, because when I think about these issues and my conversations with farmers and other people that have skepticism about what science might be telling them, what it seems to boil down to is not so much that they are skeptical of scientists, but rather they are skeptical of policy implications.
Right.
They're concerned about how policy will be forced upon them from a high. And they are so uncomfortable with policy implications that they try to step back and deny that there is a problem that needs a policy response. And so I guess I'm interested in Adam's way that you address that. I mean, when you ask a farmer, are you concerned about something? If you frame the question as one specific thing, like climate change, you may be missing the real concern, which is government intervention. And so how do we parse those things and get at what really is the biggest concern of the farmer? And I don't know if government intervention is the biggest concern, but that's what I hear so much when I talk to farmers. And so when they deny certain things, it's really more, I don't know how to prevent the government intervention, so maybe I will deny the problem that might merit a government response. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that brings up a good point. We hear a lot in our interviews with farmers, you bring up the topic climate change, and then the conversation instantly swifts to these federal policies, comments like, oh, they want me to stop driving my tractor, or oh, they want my cows to stop farting, or those types of things.
It's actually burping. The cow burps, not the cow farts.
Yeah, so that's why we really recommend as agricultural scientists though to communicate these types of things, to frame it in terms of climate and climate science and the ability and the tools of climate science to mitigate risks associated with weather extremes. Because yes, climate change, that phrase does seem to evoke these sort of the big federal level decisions that do influence decision making on the landscape. So it's a very complicated topic.
Yes.
But how do you get at what really concerns the farmer? I mean, it just seems that as a survey developer, you obviously think about how the survey language shapes what the person thinks about. So how do we write the right survey questions?
And Joel, you are an experienced survey writer yourself, and have your students develop surveys and stuff too. I mean, is this something that is this a question that you've tried to ask or pose in this area?
Well, so just from my perspective, when I have students do surveys, I don't know exactly what factors are most important, but I would say when a family member is being surveyed by one of my students, there is a level of honesty and openness that could not be achieved by me, could not be achieved by anyone else, could not be achieved by a postcard or any other type of survey. So that, I think, is a key piece. But also the quality of the questions. And so I wrestle all the time with what proportion of the questions I should write and what questions I should have the students write. And I try to have some mix. I try to create certain seeds that start the dialogue, but then I really want the students to be engaged in asking the questions. And part of that is developing the questions. But I mean, this, you know, I'm doing a different type of surveying where I don't have to go through a review board, and I don't have to publish results. But I think that, you know, there is a level of intimacy in the types of surveys that I do that I don't know how that can be achieved in a formal survey. And something is always lost when you don't have that intimacy. So that's kind of my general comment.
Yes.
Which leads to this idea, how do we get both the farmers and the people out here eating the food and looking at the prices of food and looking at the climate change and all the things that we're experiencing, and how do we get these, as we've done today, thank you for doing that, bringing farmers and the general public together to hear, at least to the best of our ability, the farmer's side of this, and then some of us bringing what we're concerned about, the economics, the effect on the land, the effect on the water, the effect of pesticides being used and so forth, affecting the general population. So I'm glad you brought up this problem about, or a concern anyway, about the surveys, because how are we going to, in our universities, bring both of these voices into these surveys and reflect what the general populace does, because there's always going to be exceptions to the rule, people who don't fit into those general, you know, surveys that only covers just a certain proportion of the United States or the world. It doesn't cover everybody. That's just the nature of research itself. It can be very limited. So what do you think, Adam? How can we address that bridge there where we can get both of these voices into those surveys? And do you have constraints in being able to do that?
Yeah, you all are bringing up a lot of sharp topics that we discuss in extensiveness in our meetings on these topics and developing surveys. And a note on that, you know, you always come up with 300 questions you want to ask, and then you have to whittle it down to 30 questions that you can actually ask and hope that the farmer actually answers maybe 20 of them. So it's always tricky, the wording and the timing. The attention span for filling out surveys has been declining over the years for a number of reasons. So that tool is a very challenging technique. And another thing about getting farmers to the table to get their viewpoint on how science develops. We talk about farmers and, you know, we sort of umbrella them as this homogeneous group, when in reality individual farmers are, you know, very different. They have very different upbringings, they have very different biological conditions within their farm, they have different economic incentives. And so when we're thinking about farmers as a group, we need to be careful in getting all the different viewpoints and all the different motivations that farmers are bringing to this table and what science would be helpful for them.
Did you stratify, so, you know, you showed us the overall percentages, but if you looked at younger versus older, bigger versus smaller operators, are you able to see any differences from whatever biographical data you collected?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of really neat demographic analysis you can do with the data. You can see the age thing, you can see the geographic location, you can see income, whether or not they have an off-farm job. And I think going back to an earlier question, a question on the survey in regards to what extent people perceive that the government should provide assistance in addressing these concerns about climate change. And you can see that the people who actually believe climate change is humanly caused are much more supportive of government support for climate change research, whereas people who do not believe it's occurring are not supportive. And so these belief systems that we form in different ways through our family and community networks really do influence how we perceive not only science, but also the political process and what role policy should play in these decisions.
And what you said earlier too about, and Jim and I talked about this a little bit on the phone as well, is the role that extension agents and extension offices play in communities, and just the, you know, if they are interacting with farmers often, you know, they might be a little bit more open to science than, like if a farmer is getting a lot of their agronomic education from a company, that, you know, though obviously that's valuable, and it's really hard to say what is better than the other, but as you know, budgets shrink and that funding source to those extension offices shrinks, you have fewer agents who are doing less work and spending less time with our farmers, which I think is problematic. John?
Well, people have brought up food shortages, and I feel like the elephant in the room in conversations like this is that there may be limits to the resilience of mechanical monoculture. I mean, mechanical cultivation, herbicides, all that is a substitute for labor, and you know, we're losing the chemical treadmill right now, and that's another elephant in the room, because you know the only thing that's been holding together grain farming in the last 20 years since integrated pest management fell apart has been herbicides, and you know, if we're not talking about small, diversified, carefully managed diversity and more people on the landscape. Wendell Berry's thing he's been harping on for the last 10 or 20 years is more, you know, a right ratio of eyes per acre, and I don't think we can be talking in all seriousness about resilience as long as we're still talking about mechanical monoculture.
I would like to say, and maybe Adam knows this, but Palmer amaranth, which is, you know, a big pest, right? That's a really big problem. That's one of the weeds that's developed a lot of resistance to a lot of different kinds of herbicides, is actually something at a very young age that you can forage and eat. So,
Makes a good salad.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and give a shout out that you're doing the foraging thing as part of this series, because I think that's really cool. And coming back to the food comment earlier, you know, we're sort of all here with this cultural conception that food is produced by humans. It's something that we produce from the earth, when in reality, there's dozens and dozens of plants that Mother Nature is growing just fine by herself all over, everywhere in the world right now. And so there is a balance between the modern age of production, which has allowed our population and comfort and these other great things we cherish, you know, today. But likewise, that needs to be balanced, and understand that foraging for wild edibles isn't something of only the past, and it isn't something that has gone away. And so it is a tool that we should actually utilize and appreciate.
I got to interview one of the largest GDP farms in Oklahoma, in the panhandle of Oklahoma, and they primarily grow corn and soybeans and hogs, which corn and soybeans equal meat, which is food, which is a conversation and a fair criticism. But they also, so, you know, it's the panhandle of Oklahoma. Nothing grows in the panhandle of Oklahoma. And so they tap into these huge, you know, I'm pretty sure it's the Ogallala that they sit on top of. But they have, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in this well system that they have, and they've got the big center pivot irrigation system, and if one of the little nozzles on one of those pivoters goes out and stops working, the farm manager gets a text message in the middle of the night and tells them which arm and which nozzle. So they're using all of this technology, but at the same time, they have a water witcher that has been used by the family for decades, and like they're the water witching family, and so they go to them when they're gonna invest and sink a whole bunch of money into drilling a new well. They go to the water witcher, and he walks out with his divining rod, and so I mean, I think the past and the present, and who knows what we'll face in the future. Hopefully, we can kind of bring those things together. Somebody had a question back here. Yes.
So I think, as John said, the elephant in the room is also corporations. I was brought I'm a city boy, but I came here and I stayed here, and I love the country. And one of the beautiful things that I think that all of us in here really enjoy is to take the drive into the country and see the beautiful landscape. We enjoy, and as we drive, we enjoy the little places that used to be farmsteads. But they're all dilapidated, beautiful barns are broken down, and that culture, that individual farmer is gone or is being choked out. And I have several friends that are big-time farmers, and it's, yield, and I gotta put this on the land, and I gotta do this, and I gotta follow this policy. I mean, it's statistics came from corn. So it's getting the most out of that piece of land. And what it's done is taken the romance out of life for farmers, and we're losing something there. And we're all in here, we love to eat some good food. I'm part of a CSA, and I gave a conversation about CSAs and how whether Monsanto or whomever helps. I don't mind, having corporate stand side by side by individual farmers, but the individual farmer is being pushed to the wayside. He's under intense pressure to make his livelihood. There was a time where all the individual farmers were, mortgage was due or bills needed to be paid, and whatever it was, a lot of them have dissipated and are gone. The children don't want to be farmers anymore, and the large machinery, it's all coming in. And, it's one of those things where we have to find a solution so that so both can exist. I'm sure, what is Monsanto doing to help, let's say, CSA groups prosper? What is our government doing to make CSA prosper? There's all kinds of policies that are pushed out to help farmers, but what farmers are they? Are they individual farmers? I mean, this conversation is not pointing fingers, it's just saying the elephant in the room is that our food is being jeopardized and our quality of life is being jeopardized, and we all know it. I mean, I know it. I love going and picking up my own food and planting it and doing all those things. There's this thing about putting a seed in the ground, nurturing it, and then bringing it to a harvest, and then eating it and loving it. So the thing here is that all of this mechanization, all this stuff for the bottom dollar has kind of created this big elephant in the room that we're kind of ignoring, or we need to bring it out and have more further discussion. It's great that we're all here, because it's truly an important thing. The thing that like I said, as I drive, there aren't any of these little farmsteads that you can go and visit. They're just falling apart and falling down, and I think that's part of our heritage. Anyhow, that's just a statement.
So I'm curious, we have some younger farmers here. I know.
Future farmers.
Right, I know.
We love you.
Joel invited you guys to come, but what are your thoughts? We haven't heard from you at all. I would love to know, what you guys think about, if this is a conversation that you have with your folks at all. Abby? Yes.
So what about the future of agriculture that we're being taught? What I have been looking into the most is using, no soil and no water loss and no energy, growing plants hydroponically with LEDs off of a solar panel, so that there's no energy loss, it's sustainable, you can grow it anywhere, no matter what the conditions fluctuate and change to be. And that's how I eat all my vegetables. I don't go to Hy-Vee or anywhere and buy them. I just grow them in my basement because it's I don't know, it's the best way to do it, I think. So,
There's
I think
there's
there's
definitely
definitely
some
a future in
energy
that.
use though, right? Because you're
Well, if
well,
you're
no, okay, so you're
running
using
on
solar panels.
yeah, and that's the
Got
biggest
it.
cost. It's just like a very expensive cost to start, but once you have it, then it's mobile. You know, I rent all around the U.S. and I can take my equipment with me everywhere I go and have all the vegetables I need. And I think that's kind of where agriculture is going, especially with everyone moving into cities. We're going to have, I think, 70 to 80% of our population in cities within the decade. So they don't have a plot of land to grow their farm or the small farms that you're talking about, but still there's it lowers blood pressure even just to work with plants. And if that has to be in a tub of water in your apartment, you know, I just think that's where it's going to be going.
So do you want to teach our next workshop?
Maybe.
Okay. All right, we can talk about that. Yeah.
To address the concerns of the gentleman over there, Bob Berglund said 30 years ago that farm subsidies would turn rural America into a ghetto. Having lived in rural America all my life, that's exactly what's happened. We've lost our economic base. We have no businesses. We're basically just and Macomb. I mean, I
Shriveling up.
And Macomb's the same way. Macomb isn't near the city it was 40 years ago. So I think that's an issue that we really need to address, because even though agriculture might have had the 4 or 5 best years in history, rural America is dying. Now, whether that's something that can be addressed, I don't know, but it is the reality of living in rural America all my life. It's dying, and we're circling the drain.
I'm going to plug Harvest Public Media quickly because we've done some good, pretty decent reporting on subsidies and the nuances thereabouts. But did you want to say something, Joel, or are you just holding the mic?
Well, I appreciate very much that you invited my students to share some thoughts. Thank you, Jim. Does anybody else want to share something, Alan?
You guys try to share something, you're going to be in trouble.
No, you never get in trouble.
I guess something that's really being pushed, especially Western and Dr. Gruber and our other professors, is sustainable agriculture, and that's being a big push. Whether and there's multiple things to that. I don't think there's one really exact way to do it. I mean, people have done agriculture differently, through history. But I think that just as, a lot of the Iowa State, U of I, we push sustainable agriculture, it's going to last, whether that is, some of the things that you guys have talked about in here, or maybe there's other strategies, stuff that the seed companies are doing, and management practices. That's something that's really being pushed in universities and stuff like that.
Alan, can I ask, you took the sustainable ag class with me.
Yeah.
You're taking classes with Dr. Bernards. What is it like when you hear something interesting and you go home and talk about it? How does that conversation turn out?
Well, it's something, I mean, my family, my uncle has a farm down south, and it's about an hour south of Springfield. And he's actually, interested in some of the things. He hasn't really gotten into cover crops and stuff like that yet. And, I came up here and I kind of learned these things, and just going back to cover crops, I didn't really know a whole lot, coming until I got here. And now learning that, they're wanting to learn a lot more. And I know, talking to other people that I have class with, they're wanting to learn a lot more about, practices like that and stuff that we're learning here. And somebody mentioned, I think it was, how do we kind of bridge the gap between ag and the public? And, that's one thing with, things like this and, other events like this, that's one way that can be done, because, there's so much misinformation out there that if we have more events like this, I think that can help bridge the gap between farmers and agriculture and the general public.
Thanks. You had a question. You skipped over.
He mentioned hydroponics, and I went by a greenhouse and they had hydroponic tomatoes, and I was just thinking of the possibility of growing corn hydroponically. I'm not a farmer, or I'm a gardener. But it kind of upset me because I saw these big plastic cans of the food that they throw in the water, and I'm trying to figure out what's in there. And just from a gardening standpoint, I can't believe that a tomato grown in whatever they put in that water is as good as my tomatoes I grow in the soil, but that's just my old gardening perspective, you know, from way back, from my grandma growing stuff in her garden.
Where was this in Illinois?
No, it was in Iowa. I'm from Keokuk, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I also was going to ask about how does a farmer feed their soil so it keeps growing, other than, I mean, I know how we used to do it, but how do they do that? Is that all with chemicals, purchased chemicals? Is that all with, you know, I'm just sort of the dummy in the room here, so.
No, I mean, I don't know.
I can respond to the first half, maybe. In terms of hydroponics, actually, the keynote speaker at the field days last year was talking about plant immune systems, and under his theory, there are functions of the soil having to do with nutrient transfer. So there are things the soil can do that a hydroponic system can't do. That said, hydroponics are a really good choice in certain areas, like if you're in a city and you have space constraints. Hydroponics or aquaponics, and aquaponics involves cycling water continually rather than flushing it through, so there are different approaches to that. So soil can do some things that hydroponics can't do, but hydroponics still has a place, and I don't want to answer the second half.
Joel, do you want to?
Well, I would just comment, we've heard Troy, we've heard Alan, and other people mention cover crops. Cover crops are an old practice that is now being done in new ways. And it's very exciting to look at some of the larger scale, high-tech farmers in McDonough County who are planting thousands of acres of cover crops. And they're using sophisticated methods that are not the same as their grandfather's practices, but are borrowing from some of those practices that they learned historically.
So when I drove over from Keokuk and I saw all these big farms, and a lot of people were out plowing their fields.
Absolutely.
I don't think I've seen a big, large cover crop of, what is a cover crop? Clover is?
Well, so a cover crop is any type of species that you would plant
to nourish the soil.
To protect the soil from erosion, to bring nutrients into, to protect environmental losses of nutrients, to bring nutrients into forms that might be available for the next crop. There are lots of different possibilities, but I would agree at this time of year, you're not seeing very many green fields, partly because either the cover crop has already been terminated, or in many cases that, we have a lot of fields that don't have any cover crops on them in the parts of Illinois that are relatively flat. So, coming from Keokuk, you were coming through a lot of landscapes that probably don't have as many cover crops as some of the more highly erodible parts of Illinois.
So you use cover crops to feed those hilly grounds that don't have real good. Okay.
So historically, that was the #1 reason to plant a cover crop, to prevent soil erosion, and that still is very important. But we have new microbiology research that's understanding immune responses. Plants don't have the same type of immune system as we do, but they do prevent disease. There are actually plant responses that make the plant more resistant depending on what's happening in their root system. And so those types of things are being worked on from all different angles.
So Monsanto, what does Monsanto do to say, okay, buy this product and it's going to really nourish your soil so you grow a larger, I don't know, what do they put on the soil from Monsanto?
Well, we're, for the most part, we're not in the business, I mean, that's not the business that we're in, is fertilizers or that type of thing.
Okay.
So we are doing agronomic systems research,
Okay.
which is a big umbrella term for how do you grow plants, and you know, what's the best way to grow that crop, and part of that is cover, and we're not in the business of selling cover crops, you know, but
Why
we are
aren't
in the
you?
business. Well, but what I'm saying is that we, you know, other companies are, and that's
Yeah.
fine. We are in the business, obviously, yes, we're in the business to sell seed and traits and that type of thing, but
Do you think that could happen in the future?
Monsanto's always getting into something new. But
Monsanto.
what I'm trying to say is that we're also in the business of trying to help farmers understand different tools and techniques and things that they can do to make the seed that we sell them, the products that we sell them, perform better and become more productive. And cover crops is one aspect of that.
What I was going to say is Monsanto is the world's biggest seed company today, but 30 years ago, you weren't a seed company.
Right.
Right? Monsanto has become a seed company because they saw that as a tremendous business opportunity. Monsanto is acquiring right now a number of biological companies that make biological seed treatments, and are opening the black box of what's happening in the soil, and that's something that I'm teaching about right now this week. I think Monsanto looks at business opportunities, and obviously they apply them in ways that have to fit very large numbers of acres, because they have, when they have millions of dollars going to research, they need to have broad applications. That is not the same as figuring out what fits a particular farm best. And so we certainly need innovative farmers and smaller companies figuring out what works best, on a smaller scale. But the potential of bringing a Monsanto R&D budget into biological research is tremendous. And so I appreciate that type of research, as well as the smaller scale innovation that is required. We need both types of approaches.
And I'm going to make that the final word. So thank you all for coming. Thank you guys so much for coming. Can we please give our panelists a round of applause? And yourselves too, because you're here and you asked wonderful questions and are very informed and engaged, and I appreciate that. We have this beautiful table over here. It's our swag table. It's got stuff from Harvest Public Media, stuff from Tri-States Public Radio, so grab some free stuff. Also, if you want to be contacted for the foraging event or any of the things that we're doing in the future, we can put you in touch with Heather, send an email. There's a stack of my cards on the table if you have story ideas that you think I should maybe be investigating. I'd love to hear from you. I'm going to stick around and have a slice of pizza and a glass of wine, so if anybody else wants to stick around and kind of continue this conversation in a less formal manner, I invite you to do so.
Okay, wait.
Yes.
Forgot my thing. There's been other hydroponics, there was an applause for that, and it doesn't have to be ag-related. If you have other things you think we should bring a panel of experts on, please, I have cards too, you can take my card, you can email me, you can email the station. Again, it doesn't just have to be ag-related.
Right, yeah, if you have ideas.
Because we want to do outreach that's meaningful to our listeners and meaningful to the community, and I think this has, you can boo me if I'm wrong, but I think this has proved to be such an event. I think we've all learned a lot, so we'd like to do more of these things.
Great stuff. Good. Thank you.